Now, these are devastating and truly horrific allegations.
Princess Anne had seen many difficult moments in her long royal life, but nothing could have prepared her for this particular battle. One that began not with a foreign enemy, but with someone sitting at the same royal dinner table. A trail of secret gatherings, high-profile strangers, and suspicious financial connections eventually pointed to a single woman, Laura Lopes, Queen Camilla's own daughter. What disturbed Anne most was not just what had happened, but where it had happened. Inside Balmoral Castle, one of the most sacred symbols the British monarchy possesses. As she began connecting the dots, unusual schedules, unauthorized personnel, and Laura's repeated presence near the estate, an even darker layer emerged. Camilla herself appeared to be quietly enabling it all. Anne found herself at a crossroads between loyalty to family and loyalty to the crown. If what she suspected proved true, this would not end as a private matter. The very foundation of public trust in the monarchy could crack wide open. Was Anne uncovering a deliberate conspiracy, or had she already crossed a line from which there was no returning? It was a crisp, overcast morning when Princess Anne stepped out of her Range Rover onto the gravel drive of Balmoral Castle. The Highland wind bit at her face as she straightened her coat and looked up at the estate. The granite walls were as commanding as ever, the towers standing firm against the gray Scottish sky, the grounds immaculate. She had arrived ahead of schedule. An official royal reception was set for later that day, the kind of formal occasion she genuinely valued as a living reminder of the monarchy's continuity and dignity. She pushed through the entrance and headed straight for the Grand Hall, expecting the familiar order that had governed every royal gathering here for generations. But the moment she crossed the threshold, her footsteps slowed. Something was deeply wrong. The hall she had known since childhood was unrecognizable. The long ceremonial oak tables, the same ones Queen Elizabeth had presided over during decades of royal history, were gone. In their place stood sleek, low-profile modern furniture, pale gray armchairs, glossy surfaces, the kind of aesthetic you would find in a boutique hotel or a private members club in Mayfair, not inside a royal castle. The iconic chandelier light, warm and golden and ancient feeling, had been replaced by sharp, cold white lighting that made the space feel clinical. Floral arrangements in the royal palette were absent. Instead, minimalist centerpieces sat on tables positioned without the traditional hierarchical layout that protocol had always demanded. It looked less like a royal residence and more like a venue dressed for a wealthy private clientele. Anne stood very still, absorbing what she was seeing. She had an instinct for protocol honed over decades, and every instinct she possessed was now screaming. She walked the length of the hall slowly, cataloging each detail. The ancestral portraits remained, but they now presided over a room that no longer honored them. She paused near a side table and spotted something that sent her pulse raising. Remnants of premium wine bottles, labels from vineyards that appeared on no royal procurement list, the kind of labels associated with private wealth and exclusivity, rather than official state function. This was not Balmoral as it was meant to be. This was something else entirely. She summoned the nearest member of staff, a long-serving attendant named William, who had been part of the Balmoral household for close to 25 years. When she spoke, her voice was controlled but precise, each word landing with weight. "William, who authorized what I am looking at? None of this reflects royal standards or protocol." William's expression shifted immediately. Discomfort, hesitation, then carefully chosen words. "Your Royal Highness, we received instructions from senior level. We were told the recent functions were fully authorized official events. We followed what we were given, ma'am." Anne's eyes narrowed. Official events. And why was I not briefed? Where is the permanent household staff? William dropped his gaze slightly. On each occasion, the regular staff were placed on leave, ma'am. A separate team was brought in for the duration. We had no reason to question it. Everything was presented to us as above board. Anne absorbed this without visible reaction. She moved through the hall and questioned two more members of staff. The pattern was identical across every account. The castle had been repeatedly used for private functions. Regular personnel were consistently dismissed in advance and replaced with outside teams. All of it had been presented as legitimate royal business. Nobody had questioned it because nobody had been given reason to. But Anne had every reason to question it now. Balmoral was not a venue to be hired out. It was heritage, a place her mother had spent her life treating with near religious seriousness. Its dignity was not just about tradition for its own sake. It was a direct expression of what the monarchy stood for in the eyes of the British public. If that was being sold as the backdrop for something else entirely, the implications were staggering. She said nothing further to the staff. She excused herself quietly and walked the long corridor towards her private quarters, her grip firm on her bag, her mind already organizing what she knew into questions that demanded answers. She placed a call to her personal aide on a secured line. I need you to pull the complete Balmoral scheduling and usage records going back 6 months. Every entry, timestamps, authorization names, purpose codes, everything. I want it on my desk tonight. There was no anger in her voice. There didn't need to be. Anyone who had worked with Princess Anne long enough knew that the colder and quieter she became, the more seriously something was being taken. She understood with absolute clarity that if she hesitated now, the damage could compound beyond recovery. Whatever was happening here had already gone on too long. That evening, in the lamp-lit privacy of her Balmoral quarters, she opened a secured laptop linked directly to the Royal Administration Network. Her personal aide Thomas had been summoned from London and arrived within hours. Anne wasted no time. I need the full operational history for Balmoral across the last 8 months. Nothing summarized. I want the raw data. Thomas acknowledged with a short, serious nod, the gravity of her manner clearly registering. I'll have everything compiled for you before sunrise, Your Royal Highness. When morning came and the Scottish light began filtering through the curtains, Thomas returned with a bound report of considerable thickness. Anne went through it methodically, line by line. The first thing she established was that every single event had been officially registered, all of them under Queen Camilla's name. The documentation was pristine. Dates, stated purposes, electronic sign-offs, nothing overtly irregular in presentation. But Anne did not stop at the surface. She looked deeper, and what she found there made her breath catch. The volume of bookings was extraordinary. Over 8 months, Balmoral was reserved for private use 14 separate times. That was more than 3 times the historical rate. And not one of these occasions corresponded with any publicly known royal event. No state visits, no diplomatic engagements, no commemorations. Not one. Cue, a quiet, controlled fury began building in Anne's chest. Not the kind born of personal grievance, but the kind of witnessing something she valued being treated with contempt. She instructed Thomas to retrieve access control data and perimeter camera archives to cross-reference against the booking records. When those results came through, she leaned closer to the screen. Entry and exit records were either incomplete or reduced to non-specific labels like authorized royal guest. There were extended overnight gaps, sometimes spanning many hours, with no corresponding documentation. This is not a clerical failure, Anne said quietly, almost to herself. Someone made deliberate choices to ensure these gaps existed. She got up and paced, pressing her fingertips against the desk. In all her years navigating royal controversies, she had never encountered anything like this, a systematic concealment operating within the castle's own administrative framework. Camilla's access credentials were at the top of the authorization chain. That was factual and unchallengeable. But why had those credentials been used in this way? Why the frequency? Why the absence of real documentation? Why the deliberate vagueness in every logged entry? She turned to Thomas. I want to know who processed these bookings at the estate management level and why no independent verification was ever triggered. Thomas responded carefully. Under the revised protocol, Your Royal Highness, direct authorizations from the highest tier, which includes Queen Camilla, are not subject to secondary review. Anne stood very still for a moment. Legal on its face, completely opaque in practice. Someone had specifically exploited that loophole, and the trail led unmistakably toward one person. She dismissed Thomas with a quiet gesture and stood alone at the window, watching the pines move in the gray morning wind. The responsibility she felt was immense. If this continued unchecked, it was not just Balmoral at risk, it was the credibility of the institution itself. She reached for her phone and called a trusted senior contact within Royal Security. "I need direct access to all perimeter camera archives for the past 6 months. This request does not leave this conversation." Her tone was even, deliberate, and final. The investigation was deepening, and Anne had no intention of stopping. While Princess Anne was quietly building her case, the events she was now uncovering had their origins months earlier in a private conversation between two women, Queen Camilla and her daughter, Laura Lopes. It was a side of Camilla the public rarely glimpsed, the mother, fiercely protective and willing to stretch boundaries for the sake of her child's future. Laura had poured herself into developing an upscale London art gallery venture called the Lopes Gallery, a project with genuine ambition but a significant funding gap. Attracting serious investors required credibility, and credibility in that world required the right setting, the right atmosphere, the right associations. One quiet evening at Clarence's house, Laura had laid out her dilemma to her mother with unusual candor. "The investors need to feel that I have real backing behind me. One evening in the right environment would change everything for this project." Camilla had listened without immediately responding. After a long pause, she spoke carefully. "I understand what you need, Laura, but we have to be invisible in this. Whatever I do, it cannot be traceable in any obvious way." Camilla moved quietly and decisively. Using her senior-level access to the royal estate management system, she began registering Balmoral for private use under her own official credentials. Each booking carried deliberately vague designations like informal royal hospitality or family liaison meeting. She also reached out privately to a loyal and long-trusted administrator within the system, asking him to process these bookings without the usual depth of scrutiny and to keep supplementary records to a minimum. "Ensure it passes the basic threshold," Camilla told him in a private exchange, her voice composed, but carrying the quiet authority of someone who expected compliance. He complied without asking questions he knew would not be welcomed. Laura seized the opportunity with both hands. Each event she organized at Balmoral was a masterclass in sophisticated staging, French vintage wines, chefs with Michelin credentials, and live performances from artists whose names carried real weight. The guest lists were curated carefully: venture capital principals, major art market collectors, and senior figures from the investment world. Laura moved through these evenings with practiced ease, drawing her guests' attention to the grandeur of the surroundings. "This is where the royal family has always gathered for its most significant private occasions," she would say, letting the implications settle. "My mother has always believed deeply in what I'm building here." She never stated anything technically false, but the suggestion she cultivated, that her gallery carried implicit royal endorsement, was enormously effective. Guests stood in a hall that had hosted heads of state and looked at Laura Lopes in an entirely new light. Camilla never attended in person, but after each event, Laura would call with updates: new investment commitments, fresh interest, expanding networks. Camilla listened with satisfaction, though it was never entirely clean satisfaction. "Be careful that this doesn't grow beyond what we can manage," she cautioned during one of their private calls. Laura was assuring, "It's all legitimate on paper, Mom. Nobody is going to look this closely." Camilla accepted that, but a thread of anxiety had taken root that she could not entirely dismiss. She knew what she was risking, not just her own reputation, but the integrity of an institution that had taken generations to build. The events continued. The capital flowing into Laura's project grew with each gathering. Neither woman yet understood that hundreds of miles away, in the very castle they were treating as a business asset, Anne had already begun to pull on exactly the threads they believed were safely buried. Back at Balmoral, Anne had moved well beyond paperwork. She understood that administrative records, however revealing, could be managed and manipulated. The real evidence existed in the physical record: footage, faces, and the accounts of people who had actually been present. She instructed Thomas to request the full archive of perimeter camera recordings covering the past 6 months. Thomas worked through the night compiling the footage. The next morning, Anne sat before a monitor in a secured room and began watching. Hours of footage rolled by. She moved through it steadily, methodical and unhurried. And then, there it was, a dark luxury salon registered to Laura Lopes, pulling up to Balmoral's secondary entrance. Not once, 9 separate occasions across 8 months, always arriving in the late afternoon on the exact dates corresponding to the registered private events, consistently departing the following morning. Anne slowed the footage at one particular segment. Laura stepped from the vehicle in a long evening dress, phone in hand, scanning the approach to the castle with the practiced eye of someone checking that everything was in order. Anne felt something move through her. Not jealousy, not personal animosity, but a cold and sober fury at the exploitation of something that did not belong to any individual, regardless of their family connection. She pressed on. Reviewing the internal access logs for the grand hall and main reception areas, she found something that stopped her completely. On every single date that corresponded with the private parties, the interior cameras had been switched off. The system note attached to each instance read identically: visual recording suspended per senior guest privacy protocol. It sounded procedurally reasonable in isolation. In the context of everything else Anne had assembled, it read as something else: a deliberate instruction to ensure no visual record existed. No photographs, no footage, no documentation beyond what had been carefully pre-approved. She dug further. Cross-referencing the perimeter footage with temporary staff records, she began working to identify the outside personnel who appeared on the nights in question. After 2 days of verification checks with royal security, one profile emerged with particular relevance: a young woman named Claire, whose previous employment history was concentrated in high-end private event management across London. Anne arranged a quiet meeting with Claire at a small cafe on the outskirts of Aberdeen, far from anyone who might recognize either of them. The afternoon was wet and gray. Claire sat with both hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her composure fragile but intact. Anne was direct. "I know you worked inside Balmoral during the recent private functions. I need you to tell me precisely who engaged you, what your instructions were, and what you witnessed." Claire took a breath, then spoke. "I was approached through a staffing agency by Miss Laura Lopes' office. The rate was considerably above standard, double actually, but the conditions were strict. Absolute discretion was non-negotiable. Guests were required to hand in their phones at the entrance. Interior cameras were disabled on request. We were told this was standard royal privacy practice." She paused. "The guests were wealthy. Art investors, finance people. The whole event was organized to feel like an official royal occasion." Anne listened carefully and noted everything. Claire's account matched the access logs, the camera blackouts, and the perimeter footage with a precision that left no room for alternative interpretation. She asked one final question: did Queen Camilla appear at any of these gatherings? Claire shook her head firmly. "Never, Your Royal Highness, only Miss Lopes and her personal team, but the entire presentation was built around the impression of royal connection." Anne returned to Balmoral carrying both the weight of confirmation and the burden of what came next. She compiled everything into a single, cohesive dossier: the booking records under Camilla's credentials, 9 verified appearances of Laura's vehicle on the corresponding dates, the systematic disabling of interior cameras, and Claire's direct testimony. Assembled together, these elements formed a picture that was not ambiguous. This had not been a misunderstanding or an overstep born of carelessness. It was a structured operation designed to leverage the royal name, specifically Balmoral's historic prestige, to manufacture credibility for a private commercial venture. The deception had been deliberate, the concealment methodical, and the beneficiary clear. Anne sat alone in her room as the light faded over the estate grounds. The weariness she felt was not physical. It was the particular weight that comes from knowing what must be done, and knowing that doing it will cause pain regardless of outcome. She reached for her phone and called Thomas. "Compile the complete file, chronological, fully indexed. We are moving to the next phase." She set the phone down and looked out at the darkening garden. The confrontation was coming. She did not welcome it, but she would not avoid it. Laura Lopes received the warning from an unexpected direction. A short message from the administrator her mother had recruited arrived on her personal phone while she was at her Mayfair gallery. The message was brief, but the meaning was immediate. Access logs were being audited again. Perimeter footage had been retrieved. She felt the ground shift beneath her. She had sensed something was changing. Certain staff had gone quiet, the booking system had acquired new verification layers that hadn't existed before, and a former server had apparently been approached and questioned. Now this. She dialed her mother's private number, struggling to keep her voice steady. Anne is pulling everything apart. She even found Claire, one of the servers from the last event. We have to stop immediately. There's nothing left to salvage here. Camilla's voice on the other end was quiet for several seconds. When she spoke, it carried the composed authority that never fully left her, even now. Stay calm. I will manage this, but you need to act quickly. Remove anything that creates a direct connection. Everything. Laura moved fast. She contacted the administrator and issued instructions: delete the registration history, remove approval annotations, and clear the access logs tied to the relevant dates. He resisted briefly. The risks were serious, and he knew it. Laura did not give him room to push back. Do it. My mother has given her word to handle the consequences. The records were cleared within hours, or appeared to be. What remained in the system were entries labeled as routine technical anomalies, BAPs that might pass a surface-level review. Laura then worked through her contact list for every outside staff member who had worked the larger events. She notified them tersely. Contracts were terminated, a final payment would follow, and if approached with questions, they were to describe their engagement as a standard private hospitality assignment, unrelated to any royal function. Contact numbers were deleted, agency relationships were severed. She formatted personal drives and ran wipe software across backup files. Printed documents from her office safe were destroyed. Her private solicitor was placed on notice to prepare a holding statement if the situation escalated publicly. All events were private gatherings bearing no formal association with the royal family. But even as she moved through these steps, Laura understood she was not erasing the problem, only its most visible surface layers. The perimeter camera archives lived within royal security infrastructure she could not reach. Claire's testimony, if she had already given it, existed independently of anything Laura could delete. And Camilla, as central as she was to how this had been structured, could not be entirely insulated from what was coming. Laura sat in the stillness of her Mayfair office, staring at nothing in particular. The gallery expansion that had seemed so close, the investors, the momentum, the reputation she had spent years constructing, had been placed on a foundation that was now collapsing. And at the center of what was dismantling it was one woman who had decided, quietly and without announcement, that enough was enough. Princess Anne sat at the head of the oak table in a private meeting room at Clarence's house. The afternoon light came through the heavy drapes in narrow bands, falling across the surface where the full dossier lay closed. She had reviewed it a final time that morning. Every element was present, every connection documented, every inference supported by verifiable evidence. What it described was unambiguous: a sustained and deliberate misuse of royal property, specifically Balmoral Castle, authorized through Queen Camilla's credentials and executed through Laura Lopes, for the explicit purpose of constructing a false impression of royal endorsement around a private commercial venture. Anne felt no satisfaction in having confirmed it. She felt only the particular sadness that comes from being forced to confront a wrong committed by someone you have known for a long time. She did not blame Camilla out of cruelty. She understood the maternal impulse that had driven it, but understanding it did not make it acceptable. She signaled to Thomas, "Convene an internal meeting, senior personnel only, this evening." The gathering that took place was formal and subdued. Camilla arrived and took her seat with characteristic composure, though her eyes carried a visible exhaustion. Laura was not present. Anne had decided that a direct confrontation between the three of them would serve no productive purpose and risked escalating an already volatile situation. Anne opened without preamble. "Camilla, I have assembled a comprehensive record of what has occurred at Balmoral over the past 8 months. The estate was used on 14 separate occasions for events that had no genuine royal purpose. Each booking was authorized under your credentials. The function they served was to present Laura's gallery project as carrying royal association to investors who would not otherwise have committed the capital they did. Interior cameras were disabled on instruction. Regular staff were stood down and replaced with outside personnel sworn to discretion. Guests were required to surrender personal devices. This was not a family oversight. It was a structured operation, and it used the Crown's name as a commercial instrument. The room held its silence. Camilla did not look away. She held Anne's gaze for a long moment, then spoke. "I won't sit here and tell you that what you've described didn't happen. It did. I made choices I believed would remain private and would help Laura build something she had worked hard for. I told myself that as long as it stayed contained, the harm was manageable." She paused. I was wrong. Her voice remained steady, but the weight behind it was evident. Anne held the silence for a moment before responding. "Mother spent her life ensuring that nothing about the royal family's name was ever leveraged for private benefit. You know that. You lived beside it. What happened at Balmoral was a betrayal of that, regardless of the intention behind it." There was no shouting, no dramatic exchange. Camilla accepted what Anne laid before her, and that acceptance, in its quiet completeness, was perhaps more powerful than any argument could have been. Anne moved forward with the proposed response. The matter would be resolved internally, no public statement would be issued, and no press access would be permitted, both to protect the institution and to contain the damage to those directly involved. But there would be consequences, and they would be structural. The authorization process for all royal estate bookings would be overhauled immediately, requiring independent, dual approval for every reservation regardless of the seniority of the requesting party. Interior surveillance systems would be placed under independent monitoring and could not be disabled without a verified emergency justification. All temporary staffing arrangements at royal residences would require advance vetting through the Royal Household Security Office. Camilla's direct access to the estate management system would be suspended for a minimum of 2 years. Any future involvement in decisions relating to Balmoral or any other royal residence would require committee-level sign-off. As for Laura, though she sat outside that room, the consequences found her efficiently. As word filtered through to key investors that the events they had attended at Balmoral were staged without genuine royal authorization, the confidence they had extended began to evaporate rapidly. Commitments were withdrawn, funding dried up. The Lopes Gallery, which had been weeks away from a significant expansion, instead found itself managing a financial crisis and fielding legal inquiries from investors who felt they had been deliberately misled. It had not yet crossed into criminal territory, but the reputational damage was comprehensive. Laura received formal written notification from the royal household. She was permanently barred from using any royal residence or invoking any royal association in connection with her professional or personal activities. Her access to any internal royal engagements was terminated without exception. Anne brought the meeting to its close with measured words. The strength of this institution has never come from image management or the suppression of difficult truths. It comes from accountability, consistently applied regardless of who is involved. That standard is being restored here. It will not slip again. The room cleared. Camilla left without further comment, her posture still composed, the fatigue in her eyes unchanged. Anne remained at the table for a time after the others had gone, looking at the bands of fading light across the wood. She was tired in a way that rest alone could not address, but the weight she had been carrying since that first morning in the Balmoral Grand Hall had lifted, replaced by something simpler and more sustaining, the knowledge that she had done what was required. In the weeks that followed, Anne oversaw the implementation of the new procedures. Personally, every change she had mandated was enacted with precision. The Balmoral estate returned to the rhythm it had kept for generations, events anchored in official purpose, permanent staff restored, documentation complete and transparent, gaps non-existent. Not a single detail of what had occurred reached the press. The matter was closed, sealed within the internal record of the royal household, witnessed only by those who had been in that room. But its effects ran deeper than any public statement could have achieved. The people present understood something clearly now. The systems meant to protect the institution existed for a reason, and when those systems were bypassed, regardless of the authority doing the bypassing, there would be someone willing to stand in the breach. That person was Anne. It would continue to be Anne. She sought no recognition for it. She had never needed recognition for doing what was right. Balmoral stood as it always had, granite and enduring, the Highland wind moving through its grounds unchanged. What had been taken from it had been returned. That was enough. So here is the question we leave you with today. Was what Laura Lopes did a product of personal ambition that simply went unchecked? Or was she in some way shaped by a world of privilege that had always blurred the line between access and entitlement? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, make sure you like, share, and subscribe so you never miss what we cover next. The video on your screen right now is one you will not want to skip.